It started with a single scream in the middle of the night and ended with my entire life in ashes. One moment, I was a quiet farm owner minding my own land. The next, I was standing at the edge of my property watching smoke rise where my animals once lived, while the HOA claimed it was all unfortunate but justified. All of this over a pet incident that should have ended in minutes. No warning, no mercy. Just power, revenge, and silence. But how did a small neighborhood dispute turn into total destruction? And who was really protected in the end?
Before everything fell apart, my life was quiet and a way most people only dream about. I lived on a modest farm at the edge of a planned community, close enough to neighbors to feel connected, far enough away to feel free. My days followed a simple rhythm: early mornings, open land, animals that depended on routine and care, and the comfort of knowing that what I built came from patience, not shortcuts. The farm wasn't flashy, it was practical, hard-earned, and peaceful. The neighborhood around me was newer, cleaner, and far more controlled. Perfect lawns, identical fences, mailboxes placed at exact angles. That was the HOA's pride. They liked order, predictability, and rules that made everything look uniform. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, it meant constant oversight. Clipboards, notices, emails about compliance. I stayed mostly out of it. My property predated many of the newer homes, and for a long time that history acted like a quiet shield. My animals were the heart of the farm. They weren't just livestock, they were proof that the land was alive and working. Caring for them gave structure to my life and a sense of responsibility that went beyond appearances. Most neighbors didn't mind. Some even liked the rural feel it added to the area. Others tolerated it, and a few watched closely, as if waiting for a reason to complain. At first, the HOA treated my place like an exception they hadn't fully decided how to handle. Occasional warnings, vague reminders about community standards, nothing serious enough to push back against. I assumed that as long as I stayed responsible and respectful, the line between my land and their rules would hold. But tension doesn't usually announce itself loudly at the beginning. It shows up in small ways: lingering looks, reports that don't quite add up, emails that feel more personal than procedural. One neighbor in particular stood out. She had strong opinions about how things should be done, even when they weren't her concern. She watched my property more than anyone else, not openly, quietly, like she was building a case. The HOA meetings became colder, less neutral. The language shifted from cooperative to corrective. My farm, once described as a grandfathered in, was now being referred to as a potential issue. Nothing had changed on my end. The land was the same, the animals were the same, the rules apparently were not. I could feel it building, pressure without a clear accusation, the kind that makes you uneasy without giving you anything concrete to fight. Still, I believed common sense would prevail. After all, this was a neighborhood, not a battlefield. Disagreements happened, they got resolved, people moved on. What I didn't realize was that all it would take was one moment, one incident that should have ended quickly, for everything to unravel. A moment that would give certain people the excuse they'd been waiting for. And once that door opened, there would be no closing it. Because when rules meet personal grudges, the outcome is never about fairness, it's about power. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in waves, each one stronger than the last, until the calm I'd relied on was completely gone. What started as passive oversight turned into active pressure. Notices began appearing with increasing frequency, each one more specific, more accusatory than the last. Where before the HOA had spoken in generalities, now they cited exact measurements, obscure clauses, and interpretations that seemed designed to corner me. The first fines were small, annoying, but manageable. They were framed as routine enforcement, even though nothing on my property had changed. The animals were still housed properly, the land was still maintained, the boundaries were still respected, yet the violations kept coming. Improper fencing height, noise concerns, alleged safety risks. Each claim felt disconnected from reality, but together they formed a pattern, one that painted my farm as a problem that needed solving. I tried to stay rational. I documented everything, I followed procedures, I responded on time. I assumed facts would matter. Instead, each attempt to comply only seemed to invite further scrutiny. Inspectors began showing up more often, sometimes without notice, lingering longer than necessary. They walked the property slowly, taking photos, writing notes, measuring things that had never been questioned before. The message was clear: I was being watched. The pressure spilled into the community. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Rumors started circulating, whispers about danger, liability, and declining property values. I became aware that complaints were being filed regularly, many of them echoing the same language, the same concerns. It didn't feel organic, it felt coordinated. And at the center of it all was the same neighbor, the one who had always watched a little too closely. The HOA tone hardened. Warnings turned into deadlines. Deadlines turned into penalties. Fees stacked on top of each other, sometimes for the same alleged issue. When I challenged them, the responses were cold and procedural, as if the outcome had already been decided. The farm was no longer treated as part of the community, it was treated as a threat to it. Then came the restrictions. New rules were suddenly clarified in ways that applied almost exclusively to my property. Animal limits, usage definitions, safety standards that seemed written with my land in mind. Compliance became a moving target. Every time I adjusted, something else was deemed unacceptable. It was exhausting, and it was intentional. The stress began to bleed into every part of my life. Sleep became difficult. Every vehicle that slowed near my property triggered a surge of anxiety. Every letter in the mailbox felt heavy before I even opened it. I could feel the balance shifting, not just financially, but emotionally. The farm, once a place of stability, now felt like a liability I was constantly defending. Then the situation crossed a line. A minor incident, brief, chaotic, and over almost as soon as it began, was seized upon as proof that everything the HOA had warned about was true. Context was ignored, proportion was abandoned. What should have been resolved quickly became the justification for an aggressive response. Reports were filed, allegations escalated. The language used to describe the farm turned alarmist, even dangerous. Inspections intensified overnight. Emergency meetings were called without my presence. Decisions were made in closed settings. I was notified after the fact, presented with conclusions rather than discussions. The farm was now officially labeled a risk. Temporary measures were imposed that disrupted daily operations. Animals were relocated. Access was restricted. Each step felt less like regulation and more like punishment. I pushed back harder. I appealed. I gathered records. I reached out to anyone who would listen. But the system moved faster than I could cope. Fines multiplied. Legal language replaced plain explanations. The costs, financial and mental, began to pile up. It felt like being buried under paperwork designed to wear me down. What made it worse was the silence. No one explained how this would end. No one offered a path forward. Compliance no longer guaranteed relief. It just reset the clock for the next violation. The uncertainty was crushing. I didn't know if I was fighting for my farm or simply delaying the inevitable. Then came the notices about enforcement actions. Stronger language, shorter timelines, consequences that went beyond fines. The implications were clear without being stated outright. The HOA wasn't trying to correct behavior anymore. They were trying to remove the problem entirely. The community atmosphere shifted again. Fear replaced curiosity. Distance replaced neutrality. I was no longer a neighbor struggling with bureaucracy. I was a cautionary tale. And the HOA leaned into that narrative, using it to justify every new measure they introduced. The final warning arrived without ceremony. It outlined severe actions under the guise of safety and compliance,
citing the earlier incident as the tipping point. Reading it felt unreal. The escalation was disproportionate, almost surreal. The farm I had protected and maintained for years was now at risk of being erased, not by nature, not by failure, but by a system empowered to act without restraint. As I stood on the property that evening, watching the light fade over land that no longer felt secure, one thought kept repeating itself. This was no longer about rules, it was about control. And once control became the goal, there was no limit to how far they would go. What I didn't know yet was just how devastating the next step would be, and how quickly everything would spiral beyond what I could imagine.
The day everything finally collided didn't arrive with drama at first. It came quietly, wrapped in official language and stamped envelopes, as if what was about to happen was just another routine step. I woke up with the same knot in my chest I'd felt for weeks, but this time it was heavier, instinctive, the kind of feeling you get right before something irreversible takes place. By mid-morning, vehicles began pulling up along the road bordering my land. Not neighbors, not inspectors I recognized. These were people with authority in their posture, with paperwork already in hand, moving as if they'd rehearsed this moment. The HOA representatives arrived shortly after, standing together, calm and composed, as though they were spectators rather than participants. No one asked questions. No one explained anything beyond what was written. The decision, I was told, had already been made. They spoke about safety, about liability, about enforcement, words that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt hollow when stacked against the reality unfolding in front of me. I tried to speak, to slow things down, to demand clarity. I was met with silence or rehearsed responses. This wasn't a discussion, it was an execution of power. The farm became unrecognizable in a matter of hours. Barriers went up, access was limited, movements were controlled. Everything I had worked to protect was suddenly treated like evidence in a case I was never allowed to defend. The neighbor who had fueled so much of this stood at a distance, watching. There was no hesitation in her expression, no doubt, only satisfaction. That was the moment the truth fully settled in. This had never been about rules. It had never been about safety. It was about winning. And the HOA had chosen a side long before that day arrived. The emotional weight was crushing. Years of effort, resilience, and restraint boiled down to a single moment of helplessness. I felt anger, yes, but also disbelief, the kind that leaves you numb before it explodes into something sharper. I realized that if I did nothing, this would be the end, not just of the farm, but of any claim I had left to fairness. So I made a decision. As the HOA finalized their actions, I invoked the one thing they hadn't anticipated: accountability. I demanded a halt based on procedural violations, ones I had documented meticulously over months. They dismissed it at first, brushing it off as a delay tactic, but then the atmosphere shifted. Their confidence faltered when legal language replaced their talking points, when names, dates, and clauses were read back to them in a way that stripped away their control. The confrontation escalated rapidly. Voices rose. The calm facade cracked. I watched as the HOA representatives began to argue among themselves, each one trying to deflect responsibility. The narrative they'd built was unraveling in real time, and for the first time since this began, they weren't in charge of the story. What followed was a bombshell. A record surfaced, one the HOA had failed to disclose, a communication trail that revealed intent, coordination, and selective enforcement. Proof that decisions had been influenced by personal complaints rather than objective standards. The room fell silent as it was brought into the open. The neighbor's role was no longer implied, it was documented. The shift was immediate and undeniable. The same authority figures who had moved so decisively hours earlier now hesitated. Orders were paused, calls were made. The legal ground beneath the HOA cracked, and everyone could feel it. What had been framed as enforcement now looked dangerously close to abuse. The emotional release was overwhelming. Vindication surged through the exhaustion. I wasn't winning yet,
but I wasn't powerless anymore. The balance had shifted, and everyone present knew it. The neighbor tried to retreat from the spotlight, but it was too late. Her influence was exposed. The carefully crafted image she'd relied on collapsed under scrutiny. For the first time, she wasn't watching from a distance, she was being watched. The HOA attempted to regain control, but the momentum was gone. Their authority no longer felt absolute. The situation they had engineered to end quietly had turned public, complicated, and risky. They were no longer confident they could walk away without consequences. As the day ended, nothing was resolved, but everything had changed. The farm still stood, scarred but not erased. The HOA left, knowing their actions would be questioned, and I stood on my land, exhausted, shaken, but unbroken. Because the moment they tried to take everything from me was the moment they exposed themselves. And once that kind of truth is out, there's no putting it back. The weeks after that confrontation moved slowly, but for the first time since the conflict began, they moved in my direction. What once felt like an unstoppable force finally met resistance, real resistance, and it changed everything. The HOA's confidence didn't just crack that day, it continued to crumble as scrutiny replaced silence. Formal investigations followed, not the performative kind meant to check a box, but detailed reviews that dug into records, emails, meeting minutes, and enforcement patterns. The same documents the HOA once wielded against me now were being examined line by line, not by friendly committees, but by independent parties with no interest in protecting reputations. The narrative shifted from problem property to questionable authority. The outcome was decisive. The enforcement actions against my farm were nullified, fines were overturned, restrictions were lifted. What had been labeled as safety measures were officially recognized as disproportionate and improperly applied. The HOA was forced to reverse its stance publicly, not quietly, and that mattered. It wasn't just about undoing the damage, it was about acknowledgement. The neighbor who drove so much of the conflict didn't disappear overnight, but her influence did. Her complaints, once treated as urgent truths, were now viewed with skepticism. The record of her involvement changed how every future claim she made was received. The power she once wielded informally vanished, replaced by a cautious distance from those who had enabled her. The HOA itself faced consequences that went beyond my situation. Policies were rewritten, oversight procedures were introduced. Decisions that once happened behind closed doors were now required to follow stricter transparency rules. Several board members stepped down, not all of them willingly. The organization that prided itself on control was now being controlled by its own failures. As for the farm, recovery was not immediate. Trust doesn't return just because a ruling changes. The land carried scars, not just physical ones, but emotional ones. Every morning still came with a sense of vigilance, a habit formed by months of pressure. But slowly that tension eased. The routines returned, the quiet returned, and with it came something I hadn't felt in a long time: stability. Neighbors began to reach out again. Some offered apologies, others admitted they'd been afraid to speak up earlier. The silence that once isolated me transformed into conversations that acknowledged what had happened. The story no longer belonged to the HOA alone, it belonged to the community, and that shared awareness changed its dynamics. The long-term impact went further than my property. Other residents began questioning notices they received. People asked for explanations instead of accepting directives. The culture shifted from passive compliance to cautious engagement. The HOA still existed, but it no longer operated unchecked. And that change, subtle as it might seem, was powerful. Looking back, what struck me most wasn't how aggressively power had been used, but how easily it had gone unchallenged until it affected the wrong person. The system wasn't broken overnight. It had been shaped gradually, reinforced by fear, convenience, and the assumption that authority equals fairness. It took one case pushed too far to expose that illusion. The experience reshaped my understanding of community. Living near others doesn't automatically mean shared values. Structures designed to maintain order can just as easily become tools of exclusion if left unchecked.
and silence, while often safer in the short term, has a cost that compounds over time. I didn't come out of this unchanged. I became more cautious, more informed, and less willing to assume good faith without evidence. But I also gained something unexpected: clarity. I learned that standing your ground doesn't require aggression. It requires persistence, documentation, and the refusal to accept injustice simply because it's wrapped in official language. The HOA never apologized. Institutions rarely do. But their actions changed. And in that change was an unspoken admission. The power they exercised so freely was no longer invisible. And once power becomes visible, it becomes accountable. If there's one takeaway from all of this, it's simple and uncomfortable. Power doesn't reveal itself when things are calm. It reveals itself when it's challenged. And sometimes, the only way to protect what you've built is to refuse to be quietly erased.